easy is never one of those conditions. If you've got a high performance team, guess what? They're doing something hard. The human condition is never optimized, by eating peeled grapes at the entrance to Shangri-La. I mean, it's just not how we are wired. People always want to seem to seek out easy, but easy is not a condition of high performance teams and execution.
Everybody out there doesn't have to write a book on the thing, but you don't know what you believe until you write it down. Welcome to Science of Leadership, the podcast where we explore leadership both practically and scientifically. What makes great leadership, why these things matter, and how we can do them well. Those are the questions we wrestle with through thoughtful discussions and real-world stories. I'm Tom Collins, and today I'm joined by a return guest, Rob Carter. You may recall Rob is the former Executive Vice President of FedEx Information Services, Chief Information Officer of FedEx Corporation, and co-president and co-CEO of FedEx Services. For 31 years, Rob helped lead one of the most complex technology-enabling organizations in the world, an organization that must perform flawlessly, globally, every single day. Today, Rob and I are going to talk about a deceptively simple but profoundly important idea. Great leaders don't create success directly. They create the environment in which success becomes inevitable. Rob, thanks for returning as a guest on the Science of Leadership.
Well, thank you, Tom. I've thoroughly enjoyed our last conversation and hope the listeners of Science of Leadership did as well. But not just our conversation, but the whole framework and some of the ones that I've listened to that you've done subsequently and prior to that is just a fabulous way to explore leadership, to really not just make it, kind of this ethereal thing, but the science of leadership and some specificity around what it takes.
Thanks for that encouragement. Well, Rob, I want to start with a framing that came up repeatedly in my research with senior leaders. The very best leaders rarely describe themselves as the source of solutions. Instead, they talked about building the conditions where solutions emerged naturally from the organization. When you hear the phrase, creating the environment for success, what does that mean to you?
Well, Tom, one of the things that I think of when I think of creating an environment for success is intentionality. It's seldom ever just sort of wade in and stay the course or, steer this way for a little while and that way for a little while. Intentionality is a really critical aspect of coming up with high performance organizations and the environment required for them to execute effectively. So intentionality is the word that jumps to my mind when you ask that question. But along with intentionality comes the necessity of change. When you create those environments, they're far from static. They're not something that just sort of hangs out indefinitely. You have to have an adaptable and curious mindset in order to stay relevant with the changing conditions around you. Because again, the environment for a team to be successful in is not static. It changes with the business dimensions. It changes with the economic conditions. It changes with the technology that's available to make it successful. And it changes with the people that are there, probably most importantly. But adaptability and the willingness to change, as Marcus Aurelius said, change is the only constant. So leadership can't be static, but it also has to be intentional.
Yeah, the dynamicity, if you will, of the environment. So when we're talking about creating the environment, we're not necessarily talking about the environment at large in which we're operating in. It's more that group of people, the capabilities, the relationships and resources that are needed to then function within the larger environment.
Yeah, yeah, and that is something that changes as people change. It changes as strategy changes. It changes in many ways across time. That might seem at odds with the notion that it's just stay the course or go with the flow or whatever. Because in addition to that change, you have to have a framework that works for you, a framework that you can snap that change into. That are things that are sort of immutable across time, and things that don't change, like integrity, like belief, like purpose, like vision. All of those things are critical aspects of having a team that understands where they need to go and exhibiting the leadership necessary to get them to get the entire team to want to go there with you.
Those characteristics and traits are so vital. One of the most consistent findings, if we look across decades of research, is that performance is heavily shaped by context and by the environment that leaders create. So this idea that we're talking about, rather than by individual talent alone. So, I think about Michael Jordan is a great example from the Bulls in the 80s, right? He was extraordinarily individually talented, but it was the larger context that Phil Jackson was able to create. So when you think about the environments where in your career where you saw teams perform at their best, what were those defining characteristics? Were they the things you just talked about? Do you have a story that demonstrates what that looks like?
Let me talk about a few of the things that I think have to be in place. And the first is, a sense of purpose. And a sense of purpose creates the why for a team. Teams have to have this belief that there's a reason, a why, why go about this hard work? Why do, make the sacrifices necessary? There's also the characteristic of having a vision. And a lot of times that materializes as a shared mental model and it shows us the what. Here's what we're trying to get to. Here is the destination. We know where we are, hopefully, but in order for a team to be high performance, there has to be a to be condition, which is really the vision that has to be there. There has to be a sense of urgency, the win. I mean, I think, given unlimited resources and unlimited time, teams can maybe accomplish a lot of things, but that's never the reality. So creating a sense of urgency with a win and a schedule that's important. Having the right players there, the who, so we've got kind of the why, the what, the when, and the who, and then the how is the execution framework that I believe is really critical for teams to be at their best. In order to get across a stream effectively, sometimes you have to have the stepping stones and you got to know where the next footfall is. And it's not something that, you just send everybody into the water at one time and, wade across. You have to have the processes and governance and structure and funding, all of the things that are required for teams to believe that the work that they're doing is important and is going to be supported. So those are the things that I believe really have to be in place for teams to be at their best. And I can also say that easy is never one of those conditions. Almost always, if you've got a high performance team, guess what? They're doing something hard. They're doing something that takes a lot of commitment. And the human condition is never optimized, by eating peeled grapes at the entrance to Shangri-La. I mean, it's just not how we are wired. And, people always want to seem to seek out easy, but easy is not a condition of high performance teams and execution. And I can think of dozens of examples across my career where the hardest things that we did were the things that defined us the most and that we became the most proud of. Whether it was surviving, the COVID onslaught of, crazy conditions inside of FedEx where, where the technology just had to explode with the volumes that we were handling because the world had changed overnight. And, frankly, those were hard conditions to work your way through, but the teams were at their best. Frankly, the vast majority of the teams that I was responsible for had been sent home. And yet we had this paradox of our operational people never got the opportunity to go home. So we felt this really high degree of accountability of making the technology perform at its best because of the sacrifices that the operational personnel were making. And then also certainly the accountability that we had to the world to, whether it was getting vaccines delivered, or respirators, or whether it was getting your dog food delivered to your door so that you could, shelter at home. And we may be tired of talking about COVID now, and it's beginning to seem like a distant memory, but it was one of those times where it was hard, and yet I would argue that the team was having one of its finest hours.
And think about creating environments for success. As I was thinking about coming up to our conversation, I kind of, and I'd be interested to get your take on this, but kind of came up with three things that really struck me that were important. Number one was clarity. What are we trying to accomplish? You hit on some of this. Who's responsible for what? What's everybody's role? Everybody needs to know what they're supposed to be doing, what their deliverables are, and and importantly, what will we use to define success? So that clarity of those things, what we're trying to accomplish, who's responsible for what, how are we going to define success? And number two was trust. Is there interpersonal trust? Can we trust the system to be fair, to recognize effort, to not punish people for raising concerns or trying to improve things, instead of sticking with the status quo? And then the third thing is space to make decisions and act. So, avoiding micromanaging people and taking away their initiative so that they have the ability to create better conditions for success to grow, because people really need autonomy within defined boundaries. So, anyway, thoughts on those things?
Well, I'm going to use a little bit of military construct. I never was a service personnel, but my father was a career soldier, and I sort of grew up with this notion of commander's intent. And then my long-term boss at FedEx, Fred Smith, was also Marine and clearly understood commander's intent. And it was this simple and clear way of expressing, here is what we are going to do. So clarity matters a lot, and clarity and complexity are not good friends. So a lot of times clarity means simplifying tasks down to the point where you can actually see and feel and execute, and have that, as long as you're meeting that commander's intent, then you have the space to make decisions and act. So I'll, jump to that third one, off of commander's intent. It's not meant to tell you everything you need to do step by step. It's meant to give you a framework and a mission objective that you have to get to. And then clearly, I don't think there are conditions that are ever more conducive to trust than soldiers and our military. I mean, if you can't trust the person, that's where the expression, I'd go in a foxhole with that person any time. That's because there's so much at stake. And so when there's a lot at stake, you have to be able to trust not just the person you're left and right, but the people that are supporting you in all different capacities. So I think you've nailed it with those three things. I think they are fundamental to excellent execution and excellent result.
Well, Rob, if we turn to the why of our conversation, why is it so important for leaders to assume the responsibility of creating the environment for success?
I actually think about that as the burden of leadership, and I don't mean that in a kind of a pejorative notion. I just mean that you have to be able to carry that responsibility. There are teams of people and people's lives doing these hard things. Again, remember, they're not doing easy things. The consequences are high, the stakes are high. And that burden of leadership says that you have to recognize that when you've been asked to lead, lead. It is a critical and fundamental aspect of leadership is taking on the burden of leadership in a way that owns the responsibility. Way too often we see, blame and, lack of accountability that goes with that burden of leadership. And a lot of times that comes from lack of trust or whatever. But, even as, we watch sports teams or whatever, when you see the highest performing sports teams, you see both on field and off field leadership that own the difficult situations that they're going through. They own the mistakes, they own the success, but they give credit for the success to the broader team. So responsibility for creating that environment where people can succeed and where people feel valued and where they have a high sense of accountability because they feel like there's a lot at stake. That was one of the harder things for me to learn. I was, have a forgiving heart and, always want to say, well, sometimes, someone's just going to fat finger something. Well, there are times when that's not acceptable. There are times where the stakes are too high. There are times where you have to hold accountability, as a very high bar and say, we're not in the business of, fat fingering something to use that phrase and then having tens of thousands of people suffer the consequences of that. We've got to get it right. And we got to have it in our mindset. I used to use an example of, when you're walking along with your car keys in your hand and you step across a grate, for the sewer or something, you have this natural reflex to hold on to your keys tighter. You're not just going to fumble them down the grate and go, oh no, how am I gonna get home, get the car started? It's that reflexive notion of saying, no, when there's peril out there, by the actions that we take, we're going to be very, very specific and accountable and careful to the best of what time will allow to not make mistakes and to execute flawlessly.
Research, if we look at it, has consistently shown that highly capable people, if they're in, poor conditions, poorly designed environments, they don't perform well. And average people, people of average capabilities, perform extraordinarily well in strong environments. And getting to this, just the burden of leadership you just, sort of articulated. Rob, putting on your diagnostician glasses, perhaps, why do you think so many leaders fail to see the value of creating that environment for success?
To me, it's a little bit obvious, but I understand exactly what you're saying because often when I diagnose a leadership condition or situation, the biggest problem is a culture that's not suitable to producing the kind of outcomes that are necessary. And so if we have this tendency to think that culture is just one of those soft, touchy-feely things, and I don't really have time for that. This is about the work. This is about grinding it out. This is about, I consider that to be intensely flawed with regard to getting the kinds of outcomes that you were describing. And if, you know, look, you're going to have a culture. All organizations have culture, but some of them have an accidental culture, that's just allowed to
Mm.
happen. And some of them have a very intentional culture, a culture that's designed to elicit trust, a culture that's designed to say, how big of a team do you play on? How much, how well do we work together? A culture that allows you to be at your best in many different ways because you think people are listening and paying attention, and a culture that holds people accountable so that you're not carrying double the burden because, others aren't carrying their share. So, there's all kinds of evidence that we worked so hard on culture at FedEx all the time. It was a really critical aspect of what we did, and we considered it kind of our secret weapon for a long time. But there was a time when we let it drift. You mentioned in the introduction that that I had responsibility for the shared services entity at FedEx, which was marketing, customer service, sales, information technology, all of those things. Well, we had made a mistake in that shared services entity because of acquisitions that we had made across time, that the people that came into the shared services entity didn't have a common lexicon for that culture. They didn't have a common framework for that culture. So we had this sort of accidental amalgam of, the acquired cultures that we had. And it was a stop, drop, and roll moment for us. We'd been through some tough times, some tough economic times, and our culture had taken a real punch in the nose, and that was our fault. It wasn't somebody else's fault. It was the leadership's fault. So we, when I say stop, drop, and roll, we found the best culture coaches that we could find out there in the industry. We brought it in, and we did a huge program across every individual in the shared services entity. Eventually, it spread across the corporation, but to reintroduce and redocument and and strengthen that culture that we called people, service, profit. And it was bound together with, if you hire great people and empower them to provide great service, profits a natural byproduct. But frankly, we had made that linear, and it came to a stop at profit. And then people started talking about, well, it's a profit first, not people first culture. And we reimagined it and created a virtuous circle where we said it is people first, and you do empower them, and that does generate profit. But guess what? Profit is what allows us to reinvest in people, reinvest in the business, and grow. So we turned it into a virtuous circle, and we built out a lexicon around it, and we held immersion sessions for every person on that team. At that point, that was a 20,000 person team, and the results were incredible. But it was far from just this soft, touchy feely thing. We weren't doing it so people would feel better, although they did feel better once they had that sense of purpose and once they had that, all those constructs. But we did it because we wanted people to give discretionary effort. We wanted people to believe that what they were doing was important so that they would commit to it. Not so we would, pull every last bit of energy out of them. In fact, people often talked about how much more energized they were when they went home or when they were with their family, because work wasn't some grind. Work was, intense but enjoyable. And so I hope that makes sense, but that's what
Yeah.
I think of when I think of that, is people that miss the constructs of culture and don't invest in an intentional high performance culture in order to get the results. I think if you just push people hard enough, you'll get the results you want. And that's when excellent people don't perform well. And in the other environment, everybody, feels accountable and does their best.
You've hit on something that's so important. Before I jump into the science of this, just to comment on this idea, people, there is, and it's pervasive in so many environments in our society, but maybe none more so than in medicine, where it's just see more patients, do more, do more. And if you look at inflation adjusted incomes, et cetera, even though, people will say, oh, doctors make so much money. If you actually look at it against the last 40 years, it's been a steady decrease, but the demand output has gone through the roof. And so, and we've talked about burnout on the podcast before, but that's how you create that, right? Is you just keep telling people, trying to get blood from a turnip. I mean, you just keep beating the dead horse, whatever analogy that we want to use, but and it eventually breaks down and puts the whole system at risk, like existential risk. Whether that's a place like FedEx or our healthcare system or whatever domain we wanted to choose.
I think it's easy though to think about, kinder, gentler in this conversation, and that's not really it at the end of the day because those jobs and some of the jobs I'm talking about require there are seasons where you really have to double down and commit
Hmm.
hard, and again, you're doing hard things here. This is not easy stuff. But if your lifestyle is just grind it out, that's when it begins to collapse, and that's when, you've missed it on the cultural front of how to renew yourself and how to live with a sense of purpose and how to realize that you're at your best when you're at your best across all the dimensions of your life at home, your life at work, your physical health and mental and spiritual health. All those things weigh into an equation of a high performance individual on a high performance team. So I just don't want anybody to be confused that we're talking about, well, just be kinder and gentler and everything will work
Sure.
out because we've already sort of covered that water that this is hard
Right.
stuff. But remember, people have, very specific things that motivate them and make them tick. And being, you know, kicked like a mule is not, every now and then that's motivating, but not as a lifestyle.
Well, what we're talking about here with regards to um, creating an environment of success really aligns closely with what scientific studies have found in various fields, and those include medicine, aviation, education, business, and others. Those environments most associated with success share a small set of common features. Folks are aware of Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety and learning behavior in teams, and that shows that environments where people are able to speak up, admit errors, take interpersonal risks without fear, foster learning, adaptability, and error recovery, which is so important in these really complex, difficult environments that you're talking about, especially when we're talking about raising the bar, elevating our game. Ryan and DC's work on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation shows that environments that support autonomy, competence, and connection produce higher quality motivation, greater engagement, and better performance. Then there was this meta-analysis by Colquitt and colleagues that found that fair processes and respectful treatment are foundational elemental conditions for trust, commitment, and high performance. Additionally, multiple studies have shown that a learning orientation rather than orientation of blame gives people freedom to improve systems, which leads to better performance. So none of those things are technical in a real sense. They're all leadership choices. They're all context agnostic to some degree. And again, they show up in hospitals, corporations, military units, classrooms, research labs, so forth. So from the science side of it, it's pretty simple but uncomfortable. If performance is poor, it's because we leaders should first take a look at the environment that we've created and correct that.
Oh, wow, that's a pretty incredible list of things that highlight the science of leadership here. I mean, it's not like this stuff is just out there. You really have to lean into, those elements of trust and communication and accountability and learning. I love that one, the most because I think that one of the things I've noticed about high performance leaders and teams is that they stay curious. They stay curious all the time. They're not judgmental. They're not overly effusive and sycophants with their praise. They're curious and they come into hard situations with a curiosity mindset. And that allows them then to assume the best, but, sometimes plan for the worst because curiosity and learning are so critical to getting the kind of results. But, you finished with the main point. If the results aren't good, you have to hold the mirror up.
Yeah. I was reminded as you were talking about learning of this, what I call ever learning. And so we had a podcast episode a while back where Lieutenant General Scott Dingle came on. We talked about ever learning and the idea that today's leadership is not good enough for tomorrow. Right? Like we always have to be improving. How can we be better? How can we, because the environment, that bigger environment that we were talking about, you mentioned earlier, is always changing. And it's not changing for our ease, right? It's becoming more complex, more accelerated, more people throwing wrenches into the system. And so we've just got to continually learn to grow and improve to be able to lead the way we need to.
Yeah, I've known a lot of general officers in my time, and many of them talk about the notion of VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And if anyone thinks that that's not escalating in this world that we live in right now, they're probably not paying attention. The
Under a
world is
rock somewhere or
volatile.
something.
Yeah, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous, and leaders have to actually thrive in that in that construct. But I love the idea that mainly that we just have to hold ourselves accountable for leading through that kind of scenario.
Rob, as we turn to the practical sort of side of the conversation, if a leader is out there listening and thinking, okay, that's all great and so on, but what do I actually do differently tomorrow? where would you recommend they start?
It's a fantastic question, and, I found myself in that same boat at one point, and what I realized, and it was because of sort of that learning complex, I always wanted to go learn. I'm gonna, call out this resource. I went to a place down in Orlando called the Human Performance Institute, HPI. And HPI was an interesting place because it blended all kinds of aspects of leadership performance, from I mean, we would work out 3 times a day while we were down there. We would work on our diet. We would spend a lot of time, but the one thing that we did that changed what we did tomorrow as compared to what we did today was we worked on our story, the power of our story. And it was important that we honestly sort of wrote out our story in an as is condition. Frankly, it felt like I was living a leadership life where I was expecting, the imposter police to kick down the door at any minute and come barging into the room and say, "We're on to you, Carter," and, drag me out the door. Did I really deserve to be here? Was, regardless of what others were saying, my insecurities really came from the fact that my story was off. And rewriting your story, and I mean this specifically now, I don't mean in general terms in your head. I mean writing down sort of the conditional narrative about here's who I want to be. Here's the type of leader that I want to exemplify. Here are the characteristics that I want to have. Here's the type of, spouse that I want to be. Here's the type of father or mother that I want to be. I mean, the story is replete with, with every aspect of your life. And there's something that happens, and I doubt this was, an answer you would expect to get to this question or even that the audience would get, but I really believe in the power of story. The guy that founded one of the founders of HPI is a guy named Jim Lair and wrote a book called
Mhm.
The Power of Story. And, there's a lot, the corporate athlete is another one of his books that, talks about the strenuous nature of executive leadership and, in business today. But the power of story is just a really powerful notion of saying if you can rewrite your story and begin to live it, then you'll act differently tomorrow than you do today. Because what we're going to do to try and remain sane is we're always going to match the story that's in our heads. And a lot of times that story in our heads is full of negativity. It's full of things that we tell ourselves we don't do well. We tell ourselves we're not creative. What a horrible thing for any human being to say about themselves. It's the very essence of, of the human condition and very much so in leadership is the creativity, the ability to imagine and to reach for things that aren't there yet. And how do we get there together? So as much as that sounds like a general task that I would give people, I would ask them to make it specific. And you can use your favorite chat app, and go get a synopsis of the power of story and get the elements of how to rewrite your story in a very quick way. But I'm also talking about physically writing it down. I suppose you can type it. For me, it was really powerful to have pen and journal in hand and write my story because, it's this unique gift that we have to take those abstract thoughts and put them in front of us and turn them into, something concrete because we can look back at it and read it and reread it. And the more often you reread that story that you've written about what you can be and what you hope to be, the more you'll conform to that pattern of leadership and that pattern of life.
I really appreciate that perspective on story. Story, I tell my kids all the time, we're not designed to remember spreadsheets, numbers, all that stuff. We're designed to know and remember story. My son had to give a speech. His speech is on like hobbies or something. And I told him, you got to bring story into it. You're going to lose your audience. Bring the story in, and that'll bring them into what you're talking about. And then they'll remember it. Right. And so this idea of story is so important. And to your point about writing down kind of what you want your story to be, the book that I wrote, The 4 Stars of Leadership, I tell people all the time, that's the most impactful, important thing I've ever done outside of faith and family. Like, I'm a different person because of that. And to a huge degree, it's exactly what you're talking about. All those things, all those lessons, the whole construct of the 4 stars, all that is guidance for me to be a better leader, for me to be a better person. And I, oh, by the way, have put it into a binder and given people the opportunity to enact it in their own lives. But yeah, that can be tremendous. I can tell you firsthand that can be life changing because everybody out there doesn't have to write a book on the thing, but but just you don't know what you believe until you write it down.
I think that's very true. And the book is amazing for those of you out there that haven't picked up the 4 Stars of Leadership. I highly recommend it. It's a series of vignettes that are just unbelievable from from a leadership cadre that's so impressive and has been through so much. It's worth your time. Trust me.
Rob, I wanted to finish with one question for you. And if that is, if you could, looking back over your career, if you could kind of go back and tell yourself when you were, I don't know, 25 or something, one piece of advice about leadership, about creating environments for success, whatever it may be, what would you tell yourself?
Well, I'm going to tell a story.
Awesome.
To do that. And it's a story that was sort of imposed on me. I already mentioned the fact that I sort of have this collegial and congenial nature. So even a pleaser is my natural, kind of orientation. And I've mentioned him many times in the podcast, but Fred Smith was my boss. And sometimes he struggled with that because he thought I wasn't tough enough when the accountability mattered the most. And I told the fat finger thing here earlier in our conversation. And so he gave me an assignment, which I found to be fascinating. And I can't tell you how many times I've asked others to embark on this same assignment. But he handed me at the time a DVD, and it was a regular movie DVD, and it was the movie 12 O'Clock High, and it was a movie about World War II. And if you read the jacket cover, it was this melodrama starring Gregory Peck, about this group of misfits, that happened. Well, he asked me to watch the movie and write a report on what I saw, and particularly to pay attention to General Savage, who was the character that Gregory Peck played. And it was life changing for me. And I'm not going to give away all of the clues, but the burden of leadership that the general assumed through this process, when the stakes could hardly have been higher for the world's freedom, for everything else. Now, this is not a true story, but it emulates a true story. And I found out after the fact. I was talking to one of my professor friends at Harvard, who was an Army colonel, and became a PhD, but he graduated from West Point. And I told him that Fred had given me this DVD to watch and asked me to go study it. And he goes, "You're kidding, right?" And I was like, "Court, no, I wouldn't kid about that. I mean, it's not even funny." And he goes, "Well, we used 12 O'Clock High as a specific course at West Point on leadership characteristics and on adapting yourself to the needs of the situation." And what I would tell the audience here is, if you're willing to do this, and I've had a lot of my team members that I've not, because these days you don't have to hand them a DVD anymore. You just say, go stream it off of, whatever streaming source you want, because it's out there. The reality is that the burden of leadership that General Savage took on in this situation darn near killed him. But it's so poignant in the way that you would think that that wasn't the case until you watch to the very end. You would think that this was just one tough guy that just went in here and ground it out with these guys. But if you really then pay attention to how it all played out, that wasn't his nature at all. And he had to put on that nature during that period of time in order to be successful. And so what that caused for me, and why that story is relevant, is it caused me to understand there were times when I had to step away from my desire to be liked by everybody, to be a congenial, that I had to hold people accountable, that I had to occasionally be able to do what I call draw the sword. Leadership isn't, it's not easy, and it's not always even nice. And that was hard for me to accept, because it just wasn't, my standard MO. My standard MO was, hey, let's have fun, let's go do this, let's tackle this. It's going to be hard, but we'll all get through it and come right. But there are and were times in my career where I had to change my nature and literally put on a persona of, we're going to get this done or else, or your accountability, as one of my team, is that if this isn't working for you to change your ways and to be adaptable to these circumstances, to hold your team accountable, then we're going to have a different conversation, and it's going to lead to a different outcome, and one that you're probably not going to like. And so there's a hard part of this, Tom, and it was particularly hard for me, and it was particularly hard for General Savage to realize that situationally, sometimes the stakes are high enough, and the rest of the team's well-being is at stake, that you have to drive home hard bargains. And so I think we'd be remiss if we were looking at the science of this and not realize that sometimes leadership requires hard decisions, hard choices, and holding people accountable in ways that they won't be comfortable with, and they won't particularly appreciate the way you're going about it, possibly until they see the end result, which is the punchline of the movie. So highly recommend it. It's not just Fred's idea and Rob's idea of a great management lesson. They use it at West Point to teach leadership characteristics. And I think if you wade through it, you'll actually enjoy the movie for one thing, but you'll also learn something about what it takes and what that burden of leadership can cost.
Rob, thanks for the recommendation on that movie. Certainly, hopefully, we'll put a reference in the show notes for listeners, but something everybody can get out there and watch and enjoy. As always, I enjoyed talking with you so much. I always come away feeling like I've learned so much, that you've got so much more that I could learn. But I really appreciate it. You've really helped us to understand that great leadership isn't about creating success by dint of force, but it's about being intentional in creating the environment by design to be successful. So, Rob, thanks for another great conversation, and thanks for being on Science of Leadership.
Well, always my pleasure, Tom. Really enjoy the talk, and appreciate the work you do.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion gave you practical tools and a deeper understanding of what it means to truly know the people you lead and how to build a great environment for success. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share the episode with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.